Greetings, maniacs, New Englanders, and everyone else. Boy, is it good to be able to talk without having audio issues. I think in my last video, which this one may update before the last one, it's all about importance. The last two that I recorded were still about Maine, but a little bit more fun. The one I'm posting about today is more about the Maine ballot upcoming in November. So I am trying to get those out more. Anyway, I've been fiddling with audio problems and I think I just figured it out. So to me, that's a big sigh of relief. Anyway, how is everyone doing today? I hope it's going well. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new here, this is Me News for Me. Clever play on words. It's just Maine news for common Mainers, everyday Mainers. So today we're featuring a couple different articles that focus on the Maine election. Coming up here in 3 weeks, I guess. That's nuts. It's almost 2024. So, staying on track. The first article comes to us from the Maine Monitor. I'm going to read the headlines, and that way you can know what's coming up, and then I'll get into them further. So, again, the Maine Monitor, I'll post these links down below. What to know about Maine's electrical utilities ahead of vote on ballot initiative by Katie Koff from October 15th. Getting power to your home involves a complex series of systems, state and federal regulators, and lots of poles and wires. Welcome to the grid. That's a lengthy one. I may or may not read it all, although it is pretty informative, so I do think I intend to read it all, but we'll find out. The next article we're going to talk about is from Maine Morning Star. As election nears, question 3 proponents explain how a consumer-owned utility might work. By Evan Popp, October 16th. Opponents of the utility buyout argue such a transition is risky based on fantastical assumptions. That's in quotes. We'll find out who said that when we get into it further. Lastly, which I'll cover on the show, question 8 by, well, first off, it's by the Bangor Daily News editorial board. It came out on October 17th. Question 8 might seem complicated, but a yes vote should be easy. And then there's no subtitle. So we'll get into those 3 in depth, but I also do have 2 other articles also involving the election or the ballot. This one also comes from the Bangor Daily News. Voting yes on question 6 should restore the soul of Maine. And it's by an opinion writer, Jason Grunstorm Whitney, who is a member of the Wabanaki Alliance. It's an interesting read, goes further into question 6 and what it means. I think we're already on board with question 6. It doesn't change any of the legal aspects. All it does is change what's printed in the printed for Maine's Constitution. No, I don't have question 6 up to read. It should have involved it here in the article. It did not. But question 6 was just about the language that was in the Constitution at its ratification, but then in 1876, I believe, or somewhere in the 1870s, the language was reduced to clean up future constitutions. The laws still pertain. They just were removed from printed circulation. All this is asking now is about, question 6 is asking about the language of Maine State Constitution and whether or not we want to bring back those sections of the Constitution in printed form. So again, it seems like an easy yes. And then the other article I'm going to include is by WMTW, Maine Election Guide, What to Know Before Heading to the Polls, by Rachel CMP, from also October 17th. That one's a longer one as well. It goes into more like specifics, and it does talk a little bit about ranked choice voting, which we do enjoy here in the state of Maine. But if you're new to the state of Maine, or if you don't know how they do it in other states, it is just decent to know about. I probably won't get into those last two articles at all, but I will include them in the links below. All right, so those are the headlines that we're going to focus on today. I'm going to get comfortable. And here we go. So we're going back to the Maine Monitor first. Again, this one is a little bit longer. I may or may not read it all, but we're all adults here. We're busy. You may or may not have a long commute home like I do, and sometimes it's just easier to hear things on a podcast or read to me rather than spending time reading. I personally love to read, but I understand why most people find it very difficult to include in their everyday life. I will include the links below so you can investigate yourself, and I would encourage you to do your own research. But until then, here is what I found. So again, by Katie Koff, the Maine Monitor. What to know about Maine's utilities, electric utilities, ahead of vote on ballot initiative. Getting power to your home involves a complex series of systems, state and federal regulators, and lots of poles and wires. Welcome to the grid. As voters decide whether to take over their transmission and distribution utility companies, we're providing Mainers with some history of the power system in the region and clearing up some confusion. Key takeaways. Maine's utility companies deliver electricity to home and businesses. The companies own and maintain the poles and wires through which the electricity flows. They do not own the means to generate electricity, such as wind turbines, solar panels, hydroelectric dams, and natural gas plants. Central Maine Power, and Versant are the state's largest utilities and are owned by investors. Note that. Maine also has 9 cooperatives and municipally owned utilities. Pretend I got that on the first time. There are 125 active electricity producers, also known as suppliers, operating in Maine, including Brookfield Renewable, hydroelectric, Long Road Energy, wind and solar, and Calpine, natural gas. Overall, Maine does not produce enough electricity to meet demand and must import electricity from other states. The price of supplying electricity is determined by the free market and overseen by state regulators who solicit bids each year, typically for 12-month contracts. Electricity supply accounts for roughly 60% of an average bill. The price of delivering electricity is set by the state and federal regulators who determine how much utility companies can charge for the services they provide. Delivery accounts for roughly 37% of an average bill. So that's up to 97% at this point. Question 3 proposes replacing Maine's 2 investor-owned utility companies, CMP and Versant, with a board of elected and appointed members and a private third-party operator, not investors. The ballot question would change who owns the poles, wires, substations, and other associated infrastructure, and who is responsible for delivering electricity. It would not change who owns electricity production or supply. First, some history. For much of the 1900s, the electric grid in the United States was a patchwork of local monopolies. Companies would build a power plant and then run the power lines to homes and businesses. At first, these networks were largely isolated, but they soon began to connect with one another. Today, the United States and Canada share two major electric grids, known in utility parlance as interconnections. Maine is a part of the Eastern Interconnection, which operates east of the Rocky Mountains. There is another in the west, stretching north to the Alaskan border. Alaska, Texas, and Quebec all have their own grids. These systems are connected but share very little power between them. This article includes some photos that may be helpful as well. The Eastern and Western grids are managed by operators, typically nonprofit organizations that coordinate and control electricity flowing through the system. Some operators cover a single state, others manage a larger region. Most of Maine is under the umbrella of Independent System Operator of New England, ISO-NE. Parts of northern Maine, which shares power with Canada, are operated by the Northern Maine Systems Operator. ISO-NE is a nonprofit organization headquartered in Massachusetts that is responsible for making sure the electricity being produced around the region by wind turbines, natural gas plants, solar panels, and other generators matches the amount being used by millions of people in their homes and businesses across 6 states. You have to keep the amount you're generating and putting into the wires the same as the amount as being consumed at the other end, said Thomas Welch, former chair of the Maine Public Utilities Commission, which is responsible for setting utility rates and making sure the companies operating in Maine are meeting certain standards. The reasons you have to do that is if you get an imbalance, the lines burn up. The system literally falls to the ground. It explodes. The supply. In Maine, the production of electricity, this is the supply portion of your bill, is regulated separately from its delivery. The cost of supply typically accounts for around 60% of your electricity bill. Unless you choose your own electricity supplier, more on that later, the price of supply is set once a year by the Maine Public Utilities Commission after a competitive bidding process. Competitive bidding process. I have questions. There are 125 electricity producers in Maine owned by a number of different companies. The PUC lists 269, but some are inactive or serve only certain customers. This includes Brookfield Renewables, which operates most of the state's hydroelectric dams, Long Road Energy, which owns numerous solar and wind projects, and Calpine, which owns a natural gas plant in Westbrook. CMP and Versant do not own any electricity production. Most of the electricity generated in Maine is produced by hydroelectric dams, wind turbines, and the burning of wood fuels. Solar accounts for around 3%, the rest is natural gas. Most of the electricity in New England overall comes from natural gas, followed by 60%, followed by nuclear power plants at 26%. That's a big change from the 1990s when our electricity was primarily produced by nuclear power, coal, and gas-fired plants. Electricity supply companies are loosely regulated, meaning that authorities do not tell them how much they're allowed to charge for the electricity they produce. They still have to meet certain safety and emission standards. These companies operate in the free market. They can sell into wholesale regional markets, or they can sell electricity directly to consumers. Throughout New England, including all of Maine, except for parts of northern Maine, electric energy flows and is bought and sold through the regional grid and market. This means Maine customers can buy energy from suppliers both inside and outside of Maine, and Maine generators can sell their production throughout New England. I have thoughts. If we produce it here in Maine, but makes us more money to sell it out of state? Are they selling it to out of state and forcing people from the state to then have to buy it from another state to do the same thing? Because it's saying we can buy. This is going to have to be more thoroughly investigated. I'm just reading the article for now. The price of supplying electricity is determined by the free market, and if they want, customers can contact directly with electricity suppliers. Very good to know. Ratepayers who make no choice will automatically get the standard offer, which is set by the Maine Public Utilities Commission, typically for a 12-month term. Roughly 90% of people choose the standard offer. Okay. We are definitely going to look into this further. I think 90% choose that because we don't understand or know of an alternative. Continuing with the article. Up until the late 1990s, the companies that now own the poles and wires, including CMP and Versant, then Bangor Hydroelectric, also owned electricity generators like nuclear and oil-fired power plants and hydroelectric dams. That was a mouthful of a sentence, apparently. That changed in 1999 when Maine legislature decided to break up those monopolies. Lawmakers reasoned that opening generation of electricity up to competition would lower prices and shift the risk of future investments away from ratepayers and onto shareholders. The idea was that competition would help drive down the price, and I think in general it probably has, said Welsh, who is involved in the transition. But a lot of the efficiencies are masked by changes in geopolitical energy markers, like high natural gas prices caused in part by the war in Ukraine. Almost all of New England and roughly half of the country, said Welch, eventually deregulated or restructured its markets, banning utilities from having any financial stake in the production of electricity. Vermont is the only state in New England that still has such a vertically integrated monopoly utility where companies can own both the means to produce electricity and the poles and wires throughout which it flows. In Maine, whether battery storage is considered generation and whether utility companies should be allowed to own it is currently up for debate. The companies that generate electricity in Maine, however, do not make enough to meet demand, which means we have to import power from Canada and the rest of New England to keep our lights on and hospitals running. Earlier it said that we import from other states, but now it's saying states and another country. I can get on board if we're supporting our own country by interstate commerce. Canada, though? I know we border Canada. Iffy. About 30% of Maine's electricity was imported in 2021. In New England, most of the electricity, roughly 60%, is made by natural gas power plants. The next largest share is from nuclear power plants, 26, followed by hydro at 5. Well, that's not... They're missing numbers in there. The delivery. After electricity is produced, it flows through transmission lines, which are designed to carry power efficiently at a high voltage over long distances, across regions and between states. Because the lines cross state and sometimes national boundaries, I need to pay more attention. Also, I did work all night. It's 9:25 in the morning. Yeah, so third shift life. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission sets the price for transmitting electricity through these lines. At the other end of the transmission line, the electricity travels through a substation where it's converted to a lower voltage. At that point, it can travel on what's known as the distribution system, the local lines that deliver power to homes and businesses. The cost of transmission and distribution accounts for roughly 37% of a typical bill. The transmission and distribution system is where CMP and Versant come in. They own the local poles and wires and are responsible for fixing them when they break and making sure the local grid can handle the energy flow through it. They are also partly responsible for helping companies that want to generate electricity, like wind farms and solar projects, figure out how and where to connect to the grid, and whether substations or transformers need to be upgraded to handle more electricity. Making sure the system isn't overloaded is important, since putting too much flow through places that weren't designed to handle it can cause power lines to melt and catch fire. ISONE, the nonprofit based in Massachusetts, also plays a role in studying this, particularly for larger projects. The lines of generation projects, which include wind and solar farms as well as rooftop solar systems, waiting to connect to the grid is called the interconnection queue. With new generation of any kind, they want to be sure that whatever interconnects doesn't crash the system, said Welch. Planning, policy, and price. There's a lot of planning that goes into managing the grid at every level. State and federal lawmakers can enact legislation that incentivizes one kind of resource over another, like the net energy billing policies that helped drive the adoption of solar by paying people for the energy they produce with rooftop panels, or at the federal level, the Inflation Reduction Act, which offers tax credit to developers who want to build low-emission electricity generators. At the state level, Maine legislation can and has also directed transmission and distribution utilities, CMP and Versant, to report certain metrics and develop their own climate action plans due by the end of the year. Maine also has the Governor's Energy Office, which is involved in developing programs and policies to reduce the state's carbon footprint. Who determines the price of all this power? On the distribution side, the Maine Public Utilities Commission oversees CMP, Versant, and a number of smaller utility companies around the state. Each state has its own PUC serving a similar function. Like I said, it was a longer article, but it was good. Before I go on, let me say personally, I am done about hearing climate action plans when we are not up for it yet. I understand we need to work towards it, but Texas, which has its own grid, California, which is on the western grid, both have black rolling outages, and they have a lot more electricity produced than we do. We're not ready for it yet. So unless we want to go back in time to when we have oil lamps and you have to burn animal lard in order to see in your house at night, then we need to take things a little bit slower. And with literal nuclear war threatening us, our climate should not be the primary focus for right this moment. So maybe 2024, we just take a couple steps back and we say, how did we get here? Let's slow the roll. Let's talk things out. We got this. So that's what I have to say about the climate. Like, I don't want us right now to be energy or electricity poor because of some potential unknown in the future. I understand it's something that we should look out for, that we need to come to terms with for the future. It's got to be gradual. It has got to be gradual. Like, if you want people to be on board with this, let's just take it a little slower. So this was a good article, and it was well written. There's a lot of different information in here. I don't really have anything to dispute. It does kind of, well, I guess in my mind, I want to know who's profiting the most, because I think it's in the next article. Let me just skip ahead really quickly. Yes, it is. So in the next article, I'll talk about how much CMP has spent petitioning Maine. Brainwashing us? It's just, with that amount of money, if they were to go around and fix our telephone poles, like when they fix our telephone poles, they look just as crappy and just as bad as the ones that fell down before it. And it also feels a little antiquated to me. When I was 17, so, I mean, 12 years ago or so, I went to Oklahoma and they have their power lines, they have their lines in general in the ground. So, what if we were to do that? Take 10 years, 10, 15 years to transition the state. When we work on the roads, we also then work on power lines and we get the power lines into the earth. Then, when there's snowstorms, when there's different windstorms, when there's different natural disasters, when cars swerve off the road and whatnot, people don't lose power because of a poorly made infrastructure. I understand why it was around in the past, but maybe instead of looking out for shareholders and investors, if we were to spend that same amount of money into converting Maine into a not self-sustaining, but getting it to where it does not cost us so much for electricity, because to live in Maine, you have to have electricity. Sure, in the summer, you can go without it for the most part. Maybe altogether if you do it correctly. In the winter, especially in any kind of modern living, I mean, there are hermits and such that do exist, and people groups around the world that can exist without electricity, that have before, that still do now. That being said, modern Mainers that expect civilized world have to have electricity. So we need to protect our electric grid and think ahead. And we're always going to have storms year after year after year. So instead of keep up the redundancy, what if we actually implemented some change that would help us? And yes, maybe we would end up spending some money for the next 10 years. But after that, I mean, there's just so many less worries by having wires in the ground than up on giant poles. I mean, I guess bird people might complain, give the birds places to sleep, but we're Maine. They have plenty of places. Birds go elsewhere. So this second article is from Maine Morning Star. It's written by Evan Popp. As election nears, question 3 proponents explain how a consumer-owned utility might work. Opponents of the utility buyout argue such a transition is risky, based on fantastical assumptions. On November 7th, voters will decide on their energy future when they consider question 3, which would replace the state's investor-owned utilities, Central Maine Power and Versant, with a consumer-owned provider called the Pine Tree Power Company. That is too long of a sentence. In advance of that referendum election, the group spearheading the campaign for question 3, Pine Tree Power, unveiled the strategic vision, arguing that its plan would save Mainers money and increase the reliability of service. Under CMP and Versant, Mainers have experienced some of the longest amounts of time without power and among the highest electricity rates in the country. The document released Thursday and signed by the original citizen petitioners for the ballot initiative also focuses on how a consumer-owned utility would operate in Maine. Opponents of question 3, namely Maine Affordable Energy, financed by CMP parent company Avangrid, and Maine Energy Progress, financed by Versant parent company NMAX, have argued such a transition is risky and that question 3 does not include a plan to improve reliability or service, as Maine Affordable Energy's campaign website reads. The two groups have spent a combined, wait for it, $11.8 million from July to September opposing the consumer-owned utility. Hold the article. $11.8 million is what CMP and Versant's parent companies, Avangrid and NMAX spent in July, August, and September. They spent $11.8 million opposing consumer-owned utility. I got something from CMP. It was $100 gift certificate, Visa gift certificate, and it's like, how are you giving this out to all of your customers when we're just buying electricity? I didn't know that I was buying gift cards for everyone on top of electricity. So you're telling me you make enough money that you can also then brainwash or use propaganda of $100 gift certificates to try and sway the population in your direction. And your parent companies are willing to lay down $11.8 million in 3 months to try and sway the Maine voter. That feels schemy, sleazy, and disgusting. Crusted, dusty, disgusting. Instead, you could give each Mainer, you could give, I can't do this math right now. There's 1.3 million Mainers, and with $11.8 million, I'm thinking each Mainer can get a lot of money, or you just hold it back from our electricity bill, and then we'll pay you once our personal needs exceed that amount. Just a thought. So they're saying that it's going to be risky, and the political nature of the elected board established if the wait. Never mind. I didn't read that far. So let me start this paragraph over. The two groups have spent a combined $11.8 million from July to September opposing the consumer-owned utility. In a robust television, digital, and radio campaign, those organizations have focused on ads expressing concerns about costs, the risk and extended timeline of changing utility companies, and the political nature of the elected board established if the policy passes. In a robust television, digital, and radio campaign, I would call that a takeover. And with $11.8 million, that's a fucking takeover. Just smear this message out there. Just get it onto every surface, nook and cranny, skid marks everywhere. Disgusting. Question 3 would cost Mainers billions of dollars in new debt, cause electricity rates to increase, and put at risk our progress on climate change, said B.G. McCollister, campaign manager for Maine Energy Progress, in a statement highlighting their major arguments against the policy. Maine's public advocate, while not taking a position on question 3, has already made clear the timeline to create Pine Tree Power could take up to a decade and would be marked by ongoing and costly lawsuits, McCollister added. In a fact sheet I downloaded, and I'll include it, the public advocate in its fact sheet estimated a timeline of 5 to 10 years to transition to Pine Tree Power. It's not that surprising. We're doing something new. It's going to take some time. To say it could happen overnight, 2 or 3 years, I wouldn't believe it. McCollister also noted that Governor Janet Mills has publicly opposed question 3. Need I say any more? Well, I'll continue reading. How would Maine transition to consumer-owned power? In a 14-page document, the Pine Tree Power campaign sought to address many of the concerns brought up by its opposition. In the report, Pine Tree Power pointed to an economic analysis, again, I downloaded it and I'll share it, that found moving to a consumer-owned utility would save Mainers an estimated $9 billion over 30 years. In addition, the group has argued that establishing a public power provider would actually accelerate Maine's transition to renewable energy because, as a consumer-owned utility, the Pine Tree Power Company could borrow money at lower rates than an investor-owned utility like CMP and Versant, making it easier and more cost-effective to finance the rapid investments needed to shift to clean energy. Also, I'm still done hearing about clean energy. Like, we honestly, gas prices, food prices, electricity prices, we have nuclear war possibly across the ocean. Like, we have bigger concerns. So, all of this about clean energy, it's getting to the point where you had people on board with you and now you're losing us. Choose your battles, choose your hills, battle only on those. And right now, this one, you're going to lose it with Mainers because Mainers, average Mainers, don't care about clean energy and the climate. And I'm only putting it in parentheses or quotes because it's an abstract thing for the future when right now your children are going to bed hungry or you don't have money for electricity, so you have to regulate how much time you can charge your phones. And it's crazy. Like, we don't need to be here. So let's do what we can to fix this right now while helping the future. And then once we get right now figured out, all gung-ho for the future. The group also laid out how it would finance the purchase of CMP and Versant's assets and what the process of doing so would entail. The price of those assets is likely to be in dispute, with Pine Tree Power saying it would cost around $5 billion to buy out the companies, a purchase that would be financed through future rates for the company's services, while CMP and Versant have argued that the price would be $13.5 billion. The exact cost will likely be settled in court. However, Pine Tree Power emphasized that it will have the resources to cover the cost of acquiring those companies' assets. Because there are no shareholders to compensate, Pine Tree Power will cover all of these costs and still immediately bring savings because they will no longer be paying the cost of debt and profit of CMP and Versant. It is analogous to moving from high rent to a low-cost mortgage, the group said. That makes a lot of sense. Right now, Qatar, Norway, Canada, they're profiting from us. So if those profiteers were to be knocked off the pay list, then yeah, I can see why, okay, we spend a little bit more to move into a nicer house to pay a lower rent. I'm on board with that. I did that myself this past year. Once it pays a sum of money to CMP and Versant, Pine Tree Power noted that all existing agreements, including net metering and solar arrays, would still stay in place. The group added that the proposed Pine Tree Power Company would pay local property taxes and take on CMP and Versant workers under existing contracts, union contracts. Overall, the group acknowledged that the transition process will take some time. If the referendum passes, a board would be formed to make strategic decisions for the Pine Tree Power Company. That board would consist of 7 elected positions as well as 6 utility issue experts appointed to help with the strategic vision of the company. Once established, the board, within 12 to 18 months after the referendum election, would evaluate the facilities and property that need to be purchased from CMP and Versant and make an effort to those companies. I thought I went to pause the video and instead I stopped the video, which means now I have to go in and edit. Thanks, guys. Just kidding. Continuing. Along with acquiring the ownership and operations of the grid, the staff and board of Pine Tree Power Company would put together a request for proposals for a private operations team that will handle the day-to-day management of the utility. That team would manage poles and wires maintenance along with customer service, billing, planning, and regulatory issues. In the document, Pine Tree Power said it would seek out a utility operator with a strong record of customer service and climate policy responsiveness, adding that the operations team would have to show continued capability and would be subject to much more stringent accountability than CMP and Versant. Once on board, the operations team would work with Pine Tree Power Company to create a 5-year plan to increase reliability, affordability, and expand electrification. Possible timeline. The plan also includes a timeline for how the transition of the Pine Tree Power Company would ideally play out. After the referendum election, The company would immediately initiate the process to hold board member elections and would notify CMP and Versant of its intent to acquire the assets needed to operate the grid. At the 6-month point, state offices would evaluate infrastructure to help determine the cost of CMP and Versant's assets. At the 1-year mark, board members of Pine Tree Power Company would be elected and a request for proposals for the management company would be in development. At the 2-year point, the board would send CMP and Versant its purchase offer. If a deal can't be reached, the Superior Court of Kennebec County would set a price. Pine Tree Power said. At this point, the board would also hire full-time staff for the Pine Tree Power Company. In year 3, the board would hire a management company to provide service to the Pine Tree Power Company service customers with input from the Public Utilities Commission. The board and staff would also work with the management company on the 5-year plan and hold town halls throughout the state to get feedback on that proposal. In year 4, the Pine Tree Power Company would actually begin operating and implementing its 5-year plan, with the management company creating a canvassing system to introduce the new organization and hear about any issues. While McCollister argued that the strategic vision document represents only talking points and fantastical assumptions, that's where the quote came from, Pine Tree Power said the plan is very attainable. So, that's more on question 3. As I was reading, I was thinking that maybe I should break down videos so that it's all about question 1, all about question 2, all about question 3, all the way through 8. I may still do a long format talking about all 8 at once, but now that I'm reading these articles, I'm realizing that there's so much that goes into each one of these that just by reading an article and moving on, it doesn't really give us much. I know that I wasn't doing much research here yet, but I am trying to keep up to date so that you can come along with me on my research. I don't want to just present all this information to you that was acquired by 10 hours of research, where I could introduce it after 2 hours a piece, and then you can hear little bits at a time as we get closer and closer to November. Because you don't want to burn out. You don't want to get so fixated on one thing that the rest of your life is forgotten about. That can last for a while. For me, it might last while I'm dedicating until November 7th, because Maine is such an important state and such an important part of my heart that I do want to do what I can to protect it. But you need to pace yourself and take your time when and where you can. So the last article we're going to go over is by Bangor Daily News, and it's by the BDN editorial board. Question 8 might seem complicated, but a yes vote should be easy. I included this because I had previously said no on vote for 8. This is another perspective, which I always appreciate, and I want to share that with you guys. Because just because I vote a certain way does not mean you vote a certain way, but I'm presenting you perspective from an independent, and I'm also reading articles from Bangor Daily News and other established papers here in the state of Maine, or even about the state of Maine. By the time you get to question 8 on the ballot this November, you might be tired. 8 is a lot of referendum questions to answer, after all. But question 8 deserves your attention and your support. This question asks, do you favor amending the Constitution of Maine to remove a provision prohibiting a person under guardianship for reasons of mental illness from voting for governor, senators, and representatives, which the United States District Court for the District of Maine found violates the United States Constitution and federal law? The question might seem complicated. The history certainly is. The practical impact of question 8, however, is fairly simple. A person under guardianship for reasons of mental illness can already, and rightly, vote in Maine today. They have been able to for more than 2 decades, since a federal judge ruled that the restriction disenfranchised these Mainers and violated both the U.S. Constitution and federal law. There is a link, but I'm not going to get into that for now. Since then, this outdated, imprecise, and frankly discriminatory language has remained in the Maine Constitution but has not been enforced. The question before voters now is whether this inactive, unconstitutional, and potentially confusing language should be formally removed from the Maine Constitution. The answer for us is a resounding yes, and we hope it will be from voters across Maine. My hope is that the voters will reject the antiquated language of the past that is not even legally enforceable, and finally align our Constitution with our principles and the law today, Maine State Secretary of State Shenna Bellows recently told the Maine Monitor. Maine adopted this misguided constitutional language in 1965. Then in 2001, a federal judge in Maine found that it violated both the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, along with the Americans with Disabilities Act. You might be wondering then, if this flawed language in Maine's Constitution has already been struck down in court, why Question 8 is needed at all. However, as managing attorney Mark Joyce and others from Disability Rights Maine explained to Bangor Daily News editorial board last week, leaving the invalidated language in the document continues to be a recipe for confusion. Certain people under guardianship or those assisting them might see the language and incorrectly think it prohibits them from voting. Sometimes people ask me, well, Mark, it's illegal anyway, so why go through all this process in changing the Constitution? If the courts have already found it illegal, if people can still vote, what's the big deal? Joyce explained. Well, the big deal is that, because of the misinformation, there is still the chance for disenfranchisement for individuals who may read about this, or people who may be helping them, and them saying, oh, well, see, it's in the Constitution, it's in your source document, so you can't vote. Joyce added that there's so much room for people to be disenfranchised while the language remains in the Maine state constitution. More than 20 years after the court ruling, it is well past time to remove the confusion and potential for disenfranchisement. Are they getting paid for every time they say that word? That means taking the additional step for removing unconstitutional language. It now falls to Maine voters to make sure this overdue update is made. After all, it's already secured the needed 2/3 support in both houses of the Maine legislature. We are fully convinced that Question 8 is the just and necessary action to close out a discriminatory chapter in the Maine Constitution. But Maine voters have not always agreed. 2 previous referendum questions before the 2001 court ruling failed to remove this language. Perhaps these past voters, like some current Question 8 opponents or skeptics, have agreed that an update is needed, but still think that there should be a process recognizing that not all people be me. Let me start over there. Question 8 opponents or skeptics have agreed that an update is needed, but still think there should be a process recognizing that not all people may be capable of exercising their right to vote. So it is worth clarifying for everyone. There already is such a provision related to guardianship in Maine's probate court, and it's not going anywhere if Question 8 passes. Nor would Question 8 change the definition nor standards for guardianship. Question 8 will not usher in some drastic new reality. It will simply bring outdated state constitutional language in line with current practice and legal requirements, while giving people more clarity about their existing rights. Though the background to Question 8 is complex, it should add up to a relatively easy decision for voters this fall. We recommend a yes vote on Question 8. I understand cleaning up the language and all that, but it's almost like, well, first off, I don't remember this going to court. And I don't remember hearing about this ruling. So now it's like they're trying to get us to vote afterwards, like, hey, we did a good thing, right? You agree? And then if we don't agree, then they have problems. But if we agree, then it's fine. And honestly, I agree with the person that said not all people have the right to vote. there are people with either born defects or they have been in a car accident or there's something that has mentally damaged them or certain different mental health issues. And it's not to say that those people are any less human. That is not at all the case. But when you think of going to the store, when you think of going out and being in public anywhere, that is a melting pot of the world. And you're very much in public. What I'm getting at is if those people that have certain kind of debilitating anxiety or debilitating mental health defects, that means that they can't go to the store on their own, or means that they need someone else to watch over to make sure they shower and brush their teeth constantly, then I don't know that those people are in the right state of mind to figure out how other people should also live their lives. And that's where I was going with the whole public thing. Like, if you're in public, you're around, you're part of public, there's a certain sway to it, whether you're in Maine or whether you're in California, there's a certain flow. And for average people, it's not a problem. It can be overwhelming. It cannot be what you want to do that certain day, but you can do it. For other people, they can't imagine doing that. And I get overly crowded spaces, but sometimes even small amounts. What I'm getting at is I don't think it's unfair to say that there are times when certain individuals either have lost the right or currently at the moment are not in their right state of mind to vote in such a way, to vote at all. Because also, if someone's in guardianship and they are all but brain dead, then the person that's guarding them, the guardian, can then essentially tell them to vote for whatever or however, and that also feels wrong. Of course, there are those people that really genuinely want to help or make change, and I would say that maybe there's a better way for you to go about it. Because voting doesn't even necessarily matter, but it is something that we need to hold on to. But I also think it is a privilege in some cases. I don't know that it's necessarily a human right. I do think there's certain aspects. I mean, I haven't delved too far into this, so I'm not going to talk anymore on that. But it's just something to think about. But this article I read because it was from someone else's point of view, and, well, I can't tell whose, but a team of people's different point of view, and I think that's helpful. And again, just because I support or oppose something does not mean that you should. Do your own research. What I've shared today is just to try and be helpful to those that have limited time and want to get on the forefront of things before they really dig in themselves. That's something that I like to do myself, but on YouTube, there was no one else sharing anything about ballot information. So I figured, why not me? So I hope that you enjoyed today. I'm going to go and test my hand at editing, see how that goes. But if you haven't already, please go ahead and like and comment on this video. Your comments are appreciated. They help the algorithm. Whether you think it's just something like, oh, well, that was a nice video and there's no response needed, that's helpful. Or if you have a question or if you have a response or a critique, keep it respectful, but then we can keep the conversation going. If it's good enough, then I'll include it in a future video. But I really hope that everyone enjoyed today. And if you haven't already, I would ask that you subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't hurt you anything, but it can really help me. So once again, thank you all for joining today's video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a good day.